America, we became a slave society. We created an ideology to make ourselves comfortable with slavery. And that ideology was an ideology of white supremacy. It was an ideology that was racialized. We said these black people are different. They've got deficits. They're not even fully human. And because of that, we can enslave them and feel moral and just and Christian. And that narrative was the great evil of American slavery. And the 13th Amendment doesn't deal with that narrative. The Emancipation Proclamation doesn't talk about the ideology of white supremacy. And because of that, I don't believe slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. It turned into decades of terrorism and lynching and racial hierarchy. Between the end of Reconstruction and World War II, we did horrific things to people of color in this country. We lynched them. We terrorized them. It was terrorism. Whole groups of people would come, thousands of people would come and watch someone be burned to death, watch someone be castrated, watch someone be mutilated, and no one did anything. And this era of terrorism was horrific. I'm going to jump right in. I think this country is a very different place than it was 40 years ago in ways that are very problematic. In 1972, we had 300,000 people in jails and prisons. Today, we have 2.3 million people in jails and prisons. There are 6 million people on probation and parole in this nation. There are 70 million Americans with criminal arrests, which means that when they apply for a job or try to get a loan, they're going to be disfavored. We've done some really dreadful things to women. The percentage of women going to prison has increased 640% in the last 20 years. 70% of these women are single parents with minor children. And when they go to jails or prisons, their children get displaced. You're dramatically more likely to end up in jails and prisons if you're the child of an incarcerated parent. There are collateral consequences to mass incarceration. This past March, the president came to Alabama. He came to Selma to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March. The members of Congress came, 80,000 people came, and very few of them knew that today in the state of Alabama, 31% of the black male population has permanently lost the right to vote as a result of a criminal conviction. In 10 states, you permanently lose your rights to vote. Our jails and prisons are filled with people who are suffering from mental illness. About 50% of the people in prison have mental illness. 20% are acutely mentally ill. We have the highest rate of incarceration in the world, and we don't seem particularly ashamed about it. These problems are bad. But the statistic that I tell you really keeps me up late at night is the one from the Bureau of Justice that now predicts that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison. 1 in 3. That was not true in the 20th century. That was not true in the 19th century. It's become true in the 21st century, and there is this appalling silence. There is this indifference to this phenomena. And it bothers me because I see in poor and minority communities hope being crushed. I go into communities where I sit down with 12 and 13-year-old children who tell me that they don't expect to be free by the time they're 21. And they're not saying that because of something they've seen on TV. They're not saying that because of something they've heard. They're saying that because they see that happening in their community. Their friends and their brothers and their neighbors are dying from drug warfare, dying from gang warfare, or effectively dying by being sent to jails or prisons. And there is this indifference to this problem. We have children born into violent households. They live in violent neighborhoods. They go to violent schools. They are traumatized by the time they're 4 and 5, and we're not talking about it. So I want to talk tonight about solutions. These problems are everywhere, and we could identify other data, other demographics, other statistics that would outline problems, but I really wanted to talk to you tonight about some solutions. I believe we can change this nation. I really do. I believe we have to change this nation. I think we can create more justice in this country. But there are some things that all of us have to do if we really want to be about advancing justice. And I've got 4. The first is, I don't think we can create more justice in America, in California, at Stanford, until we choose to get proximate to the problems that most motivate us, that most worry us. There is a need to get closer to the problems that we see. I believe that without getting proximate, you don't come up with the right solutions. We have too many policymakers trying to make solutions to problems from a distance. And when you problem solve from a distance, you get it wrong. You don't come up with the right solutions because you don't understand the details of the problems. When you get proximate, you hear things that you don't hear from a distance. You see things you don't see from a distance. I'm persuaded that we've got to get closer to the parts of our community where there's poverty and inequality. We've got to get closer to people in jails and prisons. We've got to get closer to the people coming out of jails and prisons. If we want to do something about racial inequality, we have to go to the places where that racial inequality is most manifest. I believe in the power of proximity. I'm a witness of the power of proximity. I grew up in a community in the American South where black children couldn't go to the public schools. I started my education in a colored school. When I was a little boy, I had to go to a school that didn't go past the 8th grade. My county, my dad didn't have a high school. There were no high schools for black kids when my dad was a teenager. But when I was a little boy, lawyers came into our community. They got proximate. And they made them open up the public schools. And because of that, I got to go to high school. And then I got to go to college. It was because of these lawyers' choice to get proximate. I love coming to college campuses because I look out at you and I think about where I was, many of you who are students, when I was in your space. When I got to college, I went to a small college in Pennsylvania. It was a beautiful college on a lovely campus, and nobody in my family had ever graduated from college, so I didn't really know that much about college. But when I got to college, I couldn't believe how wonderful it was. I was playing sports, I was doing music, I was studying philosophy, I was a philosophy major. You would go into the dining hall and they would just feed you. And I just thought college was this magical place. I thought when I got to college after my second year, I said to myself one day, I said, you know what, I think I'm going to stay in college the rest of my life. And when I became a senior one day, I would tell my friends every now and then, I'm a philosophy major, so as a philosophy major, I'm going to go out here on the hillside and I'm going to think some deep thoughts. I would say that to my friends. I think they thought I was getting high or doing something illegal. I wasn't. But one day I was out there on this hillside thinking what I thought were these deep thoughts, and somebody came up to me and said, you are a senior and you're a philosophy major. What are you going to do after you graduate? And I heard this as a very hostile question because I realized for the first time that nobody was going to pay me to philosophize when I graduated from college. And so I started frantically trying to figure out, how do you stay in school? And because nobody in my family had actually gone to college, I didn't know what I'm sure all of you already know. I didn't know that in this country, if you want to do graduate work in history or English or political science, you actually have to know something about history, English, or political science to get into graduate school. I didn't realize that. And when I realized that, I was pretty intimidated by this. So I kept looking, and to be honest, that's how I found law school. It was really clear, it was very clear to me that you didn't need to know anything to go to law school. So I signed up for that. And a few months later, found myself at Harvard Law School, sitting in a classroom, and I was quickly disappointed. I went to law school because I wanted to do something about poverty and race and social justice, and it didn't seem like anybody was talking about poverty or race or justice. And it's only when I took a course that required me to go to Georgia and work with death row prisoners that I got proximate, that I saw things I didn't expect to see. I met people literally dying for legal assistance, and proximity changed me. I've been working on children, working for children, prosecuted as adults. We have this phenomenon in America where we're actually sending children to adult jails and prisons. There are 250,000 kids serving long prison sentences in adult jails and prisons. There is no minimum age for trying children as adults in 15 states. That means we put 9 and 10 and 11-year-old children at risk of adult prosecution. I represent kids who've been sentenced to die in prison, life imprisonment without parole. Some as young as 13 and 14. And the only way we can make sense of this is being so far away that we don't see the details. When I've gotten proximate, I've seen the details. I worked on a case some years ago involving a 14-year-old boy who was living in a household where his mother was repeatedly the target of a lot of domestic violence. This boy's mother had a boyfriend, and when this man would start drinking, he'd become violent. And one day he came home after he'd been drinking, and he called the boy's mother into the kitchen. He didn't say anything to her. He just walked up to her and he punched her in the face. She fell down and she hit her head as she fell, and she was on the floor unconscious, bleeding. Her son came running into the kitchen to try to help his mom recover, and he couldn't get her to wake up. He couldn't get her to move. And after 10 minutes, this child thought his mom was dead. She wasn't dead, but he thought she was dead. The man had gone into a bedroom and fallen asleep. This little boy got up and he walked into the bedroom to call the police or to call an ambulance, but then he remembered that this man kept a handgun in his dresser drawer. And so instead of picking up the phone, he opened up that dresser drawer and he pulled out that gun. And he walked over to where the man was sleeping, and this little boy pointed the gun at the man's head. The man was snoring, and when the man stopped snoring, this little boy tragically pulled the trigger. He shot the man in the head. The man died almost instantly. This boy was very small for his age. He was about 5 feet tall. He weighed less than 100 pounds. He'd never been in trouble before. He had no prior juvenile adjudications. He was the kind of kid that might have been tried as a juvenile, but for the fact that the man that he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, well, that man was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult. And they immediately certified him to stand trial as an adult, and they put him in the adult jail. His grandmother called me after he'd been there for 3 days and asked me to get involved. I went to the jail and I sat in there, and this little boy came in and he sat down, and I started asking him questions, but no matter what I asked him, he wouldn't say a word. He just sat there. I finally put my pen down and I said, look, I can't help if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me. Little boy wouldn't say anything. I got up, I walked around the table, I pulled my chair close to him. I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me. And he just kept staring at a wall. He would not say anything. Couldn't figure out what to do. And at some point, I decided to just lean on him. I don't even know why. But I leaned on this little boy, and when I leaned on him, he leaned back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him, and I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And that's when this child started to cry. And through his tears, he began talking to me, not about what happened with his mom, not about what happened with the man, but he started talking to me about what had happened at the jail. He told me on the first night several men had hurt him. He told me on the next night several people had raped him. He told me on the night before I'd gotten there so many people had hurt him he could not remember how many there had been. I held this little boy while he cried hysterically for almost an hour. I finally got him calm and I said, look, I'm going to get you out of here. You stay right here. I'm going to get you out of here. And I never will forget that child grabbing my arm saying, please, please, please don't go. I said, no, it's okay. I'm going to be right back. You stay right here. And I left that jail. And the question I had in my mind was, who is responsible for this? And the answer is, we are. We are. We've created this distance from the poorest and most vulnerable children in our society. We've allowed them to kind of fester and fend and cope with unimaginable problems. We've gotten so far away we don't see the trauma and the injury and the cruelty that we are subjecting them to by our distance. Many of you have heard your whole life that if there's a bad neighborhood, you stay away from it. If there are bad schools, you don't go to them. If there are places where there's poverty and abuse and neglect, stay as far away as you possibly can. I'm here tonight to tell you that the opposite is what we need to do if we're about justice. We've got to get closer to those places where there's poverty and abuse and neglect. We've got to go inside those bad schools. We've got to get inside jails and prisons. We've got to get closer to the people who are coming out of these institutions. We've got to hold those children who are vulnerable and neglected and marginalized closer. And I'm here to tell you that there's power in proximity. That sometimes you don't think you have the tools and skills necessary to change these things, but I'm here to tell you that just sometimes getting proximate can make the difference. The second thing I believe we have to do if we really want to create more justice is that we have to change the narratives that sustain inequality and injustice. You see, mass incarceration was not created just by policies. Yes, there were policies. We decided to deal with drug addiction and drug dependency as a crime problem rather than a health problem. We could have said drug addiction and drug dependency is like alcoholism. It's a health issue. Nobody would suggest that it's appropriate to put someone who's an alcoholic in prison if we see them drinking. We see that as a health issue, but with drug dependency and drug addiction, we said that's a crime problem. And we made that choice. We decided to kind of beat up on people who were poor. But those policies were sustained by a narrative. And the narrative is what I call the politics of fear and anger. For 40 years, our politicians have been preaching to us that we should be afraid and we should be angry and we should tolerate abuse and cruelty because it feels tough. And the truth is that when you're afraid and when you're angry, you will tolerate inequality and injustice. And our politicians have exploited that, both parties. It doesn't matter who. And we've got to change the narrative. We've got to resist the narrative of fear and anger. You're hearing some of it now. People preaching that this bad thing and that group of people and these people over here, and that narrative will lead to injustice. And good people have to do things in response to that if we're going to create more justice. I think we actually have to change the narrative about race. I do. We've never really confronted the history of racial inequality in this country, and as a result of that, all of us are infected by this disease. We are all carrying this illness, this disruption that has been created by a narrative of racial difference. Our parents and our grandparents didn't talk about things that we needed to talk about, and because of that, we continue to suffer. And so I believe we actually have to have conversations that we haven't had. I think we need to talk about slavery in America. You see, I think the legacy of slavery continues to haunt us. We are shadowed by this era that did destructive things. The great evil of American slavery, for me, was not involuntary servitude or forced labor. I don't believe that. I think the great evil of American slavery was the narrative of racial difference that we created to legitimate it. It's the ideology of white supremacy that we made up to make ourselves feel like enslaving these black people was okay. You see, slavery in America wasn't like slavery in other parts of the world. In Africa, there were slaves. In Asia, there were slaves. There were slavery everywhere. But in America, in those countries, they were societies with slaves. In America, we became a slave society. We created an ideology to make ourselves comfortable with slavery. And that ideology was an ideology of white supremacy. It was an ideology that was racialized. We said these black people are different. They've got deficits. They're not even fully human. And because of that, we can enslave them and feel moral and just and Christian. And that narrative was the great evil of American slavery. And the 13th Amendment doesn't deal with that narrative. The Emancipation Proclamation doesn't talk about the ideology of white supremacy. And because of that, I don't believe slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. It turned into decades of terrorism and lynching and racial hierarchy. Between the end of Reconstruction and World War II, we did horrific things to people of color in this country. We lynched them. We terrorized them. It was terrorism. Whole groups of people would come, thousands of people would come and watch someone be burned to death, watch someone be castrated, watch someone be mutilated, and no one did anything. And this era of terrorism was horrific. You've got black people in the Bay Area. Some of you might be from this region, and many people don't even appreciate how it's lynching and terror that shaped the demographic geography of this nation. The African Americans in Oakland, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, in Cleveland, in Chicago, in Detroit, in New York, in Boston did not go to those communities as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They came to these communities as refugees and exiles from terrorism in the American South. At the beginning of the 20th century, 90-some% of the black population lived in the Deep South, and they fled by the millions because they were being threatened and menaced and traumatized. And we didn't talk about it. We didn't deal with it. We've created this exodus, and we haven't understood how that exodus shapes the way these communities continue to struggle. Even in the civil rights context, I think we have to change the narrative, I'll be honest. I hear people talking about the civil rights movement, and I'm going to get in trouble here, but I'm going to be honest, but I get worried. I hear people talking about the civil rights movement, and it's so celebratory. And everybody gets to celebrate the civil rights movement. We don't ask any qualifying questions. We don't ask any hard anything. You just get to celebrate. I hear people talking about the civil rights movement, and it sounds like a 3-day carnival. On day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on the bus. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. And on day 3, we just changed all the laws. And I mean, if that was our history, we'd be a great country, but that's not our history. Our history is that for decades in this country, we humiliated black people on a daily basis. For decades in this country, we told black people, you're not good enough to vote. We told black people, you're not good enough to go to school with the rest of us. We humiliated people regularly. My parents were humiliated every day of their lives. Every time they saw those signs, white and colored, it wasn't just a sign, it was an assault. And we haven't talked about what that's done. We haven't talked about those injuries. We should have committed ourselves to truth and reconciliation at the end of the civil rights movement, but we didn't do that. And now we're in this era of mass incarceration, and that narrative of racial difference is behind this police violence that we see. It is behind our indifference to these statistics about racial bias in the criminal justice system. It has created a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that follows black and brown people. And I can tell you, even at Stanford, with your Stanford degrees, you cannot educate yourself to the point you are free from this presumption. It will follow you. You can't make enough money. You can't educate yourself enough. I was in a courtroom not too long ago, just a couple of years ago. I feel like I've done something maybe, and I was in the courtroom. First time I was in this court in the Midwest. And I was sitting at defense counsel's table, and the judge walked in. I had my suit on, I had my shirt on, I had my tie on. The judge walked in, he said, hey, you get back out there in the hallway and you wait until your lawyer gets here. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And I stood up and I said, oh, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't introduce myself. I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing, and the prosecutor started laughing, and I made myself laugh because I didn't want to disadvantage my client. Client came in, a young white kid I was representing. We did the hearing. And afterward, I was thinking to myself, what is it that when this judge saw a middle-aged black man in a suit and tie at defense counsel's table, it didn't even occur to him that that's the lawyer. What that is this narrative of racial difference, and we've got to change it. We've got to have these conversations. We've got to confront it. In South Africa, there was a recognition that they could not recover from apartheid without truth and reconciliation. In Rwanda, there's a recognition that there will not be peace after genocide without truth and reconciliation. Go to Germany. In the nation state of Germany today, there is this commitment to talking about the Holocaust. You can't go 100 meters in Berlin without seeing a marker or a stone that's been placed at the home of a Jewish family that was abducted during the Holocaust. The Germans want you to go to Auschwitz and reflect soberly on the history of the Holocaust. In this country, we do the opposite. We don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about segregation. We don't talk about racial bias. In fact, when you start talking about race, people start looking for exits. You start talking about racial justice, people are so nervous they don't know which way to turn. We haven't even developed the habits of having this conversation, and we've got to change that. We've got a project at EJI. We want to put markers at every lynching site in this country. We want to resurrect this narrative in ways that we begin to understand what it means to be burdened by our history. It's not just for people of color, it's for everybody. A generation of white people have been taught that they're better than other people because of their skin color. It's a kind of child abuse. And we've got to help people get free from that. There is something better than what we have experienced in this nation when it comes to racial justice. I really do believe it. There is a better place. There is a better way for us to intersect with one another than what we have experienced. But we will not get there unless we change the narrative. Third thing, it's not enough to get proximate and change narratives. We cannot create the justice that we want unless we protect our hope. And I'm really convinced of this one. I am persuaded that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. And when you find yourself beginning to think that you cannot make a difference, when you begin to accept that these are problems too big for us to confront, to change, to challenge, you are going to contribute to the problem of injustice. Your hope is essential. You've got to protect your hopefulness. You do. Because without that, you will not be able to do the necessary things that hopefulness requires, that justice requires. Hope is what gets you to stand up when other people say sit down. Hope is what gets you to speak when other people say be quiet. You've got to protect your hope. You know, I had the great privilege when I was a young lawyer of meeting Rosa Parks. I got to spend a lot of time with her. And when I moved to Montgomery, there was a woman named Johnny Carr who was the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott. She would say Dr. King got all the attention, but she was the real person who made it work. And Ms. Carr called me up. She said, now, Bryan, I understand you're a young lawyer, just moved to Montgomery. I said, yes, I am. She said, well, do you know who I am? I'm Johnny Carr. I'm the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott. I said, well, I know all about you, Ms. Carr. I'm so honored to be speaking with you. She said, well, that's nice. I understand that you're a lawyer. And so what I'm going to do every now and then, I'm going to call you up and I'm going to ask you to go someplace and speak. And then she said, sometimes I'm going to call you up and ask you to go someplace and listen. And then she said, when I call you up and ask you to do something, you're going to say, yes, ma'am. So I said, yes, ma'am. And sure enough, she would call me up and send me someplace to talk or send me someplace to listen. And one day she called me up. She said, Bryan, Rosa Parks is coming to town. We're going to get together and go over to Virginia Durr's house. Virginia Durr was this white woman who, his husband, Clifford Durr, represented Dr. King. She said, we're just going to get together and talk. She said, do you want to come over and listen? I said, oh, yes, ma'am, I do. Every now and then she'd say, now, Bryan, what does the word listen mean? And I'd explain to her, I knew I wasn't supposed to say anything. And sure enough, I went over and I listened to these women. And the amazing thing was Ms. Parks and Ms. Carr and Ms. Durr, they weren't talking about what they had done. They were still talking about what they were going to do. In their 70s and their 80s, there was a hopefulness that defined and shaped their relationship to the world. And I just sat there and took it all in. And after a couple of hours, Ms. Parks turned to me and she said, now, Bryan, tell me about the Equal Justice Initiative. Tell me what you're trying to do. And I looked at Ms. Carr to see if I had permission to speak, and she nodded. And so I gave her my rap. I said, well, we're trying to do something about the death penalty. We're trying to do something about kids being prosecuted as adults. We're trying to do something about prison overcrowding. We're trying to do something about the mentally ill. We're trying to do something about children. We're trying to do something about racial bias. We're trying to do something about poverty. We're trying to do something about segregation. We're trying to do something about these conditions of confinement. I gave her my whole rap, and when I finished, she looked at me. She said, She said, that's going to make you tired. And that's when Ms. Carr leaned forward and she put her finger in my face and she said, that's why you've got to be brave. It takes courage to be hopeful when we are confronting the kind of inequality that we sometimes have to confront. When you get in those proximate spaces, those places of difficulty, you need to take your courage to stay hopeful, but hope is essential. Fourth thing, final thing, and I wish I could stop at 3. But I can't. The fourth thing that I have to tell you is that we cannot create justice. We cannot change the world by just getting proximate, by just changing narratives, by just staying hopeful. The fourth thing we've got to do is that we've got to be willing to do uncomfortable things. I've read and I've studied. I've never found oppression end. I've never found justice triumph. I've never found a situation where equality prevailed when people only did what's comfortable and convenient. If you're going to change the world, you're going to have to do some things that are uncomfortable. And that's hard because human beings are programmed to do what's comfortable. We like comfort. I like comfort. I'm not preaching against comfort. That's not what I'm saying. But sometimes you have to choose to do uncomfortable things. I gave a talk in Mississippi a little while ago. I flew down to Jackson, actually it was in Hattie's Gulfport, Mississippi. And the people met me at the airport and they said, oh, Mr. Stevenson, we know all about you. We've read about you. We know what kind of person you are. We know what kind of work you do. And we're having our conference at the luxurious Doubletree Hotel. And we decided that you wouldn't want to stay at the luxurious Doubletree Hotel. So we've asked one of the farmers to put you up at the bar. And I said, what is wrong with you? I said, of course I want to stay at the luxurious Doubletree Hotel. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that sometimes you've got to position yourself in uncomfortable places and you've got to be a witness. And I'm going to tell you something just a little bit personal, if you don't mind. I've been representing people on death row for 30 years. 30 years. And we've had some great moments. Just this past April, I walked out of a prison with a man who'd spent 30 years on death row for a crime he did not commit. Anthony Ray Hinton, wrongly condemned, wrongly convicted, lost a lot of sleep over that case. But just a few months ago, we walked that man out of jail or prison. Yesterday, I spent a couple of hours with him. Every time I spend time with him, it's just like this shot of adrenaline, and it's so affirming. But I'm also going to tell you that not every case has ended up like that. Between 2009 and 2011, Alabama had the highest execution rate in the country. We don't have a public defender system. There is no right to counsel for death row prisoners in this country. We do not meet the needs of the poor, even when they face the death penalty. One of the great challenges of our criminal justice system is that we have a system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. Wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes. Well, all of these execution dates were being set, and we made the commitment to stand with all the people facing execution, and my young lawyer started working on these cases. And one of the challenges of our legal system right now is that our courts have a priority on finality over fairness. We care more about getting to the end than getting it right. And in each of these cases, the court kept saying too late, and these people were being executed, and I watched my staff get beat down. And I finally said, you know what, you all take a break. I've been doing this longer. I know what I'm doing. Let me take the next case. I just was worried about them. And I got involved in a case where a man had been convicted and sentenced to death who was intellectually disabled. He suffered from mental retardation. And the courts had banned execution of people with intellectual disability. You're not supposed to execute someone like that. But the lawyers never raised the issue at trial. They didn't raise it at the right time. And because of that, this man was moving toward execution. I got involved. I said, look, this man is intellectually disabled. You can't execute him. The court said too late. The trial court said too late. The appeals court said too late. The state court said too late. The federal court said too late. And on the day of the execution, I was waiting for a ruling from the United States Supreme Court. And about an hour before the execution, the court called, and the clerk told me that the court had denied our stay motion. Too late. I hung up the phone and I picked up the phone to call my client down on death row. And I got on the phone with this man and I told him the dreadful news. He was obviously overwhelmed. And in addition to being intellectually disabled, this man had another challenge. When he got nervous, when he got worried, when he got overwhelmed, he also had a very severe speech impediment. And he told me that he had something really important that he had to tell me, but then he couldn't get his words out. He started to talk. He started to say something, but he couldn't get the words out. He just started stuttering. He started trying to get words out that he couldn't make form in his mouth. And he was trying and trying and trying. It seemed like the harder he tried, the more difficult it became. And the closer we got to the execution time, the harder it was for him to speak. And the guards were trying to rush him, which just made it harder. And this man was trying to say something, and he begged me not to hang up. But I was struggling. Because the more he tried to talk, the more he tried to get his words out, and he couldn't, the more he was just ripping my heart apart. And I was standing there holding the phone, and tears started running down my face. And I listened to this man try so valiantly to say something, but not be able to, and I was just overwhelmed. I remembered how when I was a little boy, my mother took me to church one Sunday, and I was there with my brother, and we were talking to our friends, and there was a little boy, a skinny kid I'd never seen before, who was standing next to one of my friends. And I remembered asking this child, what his name was or where he was from. And I remembered how when I asked that little boy that question, this little boy couldn't get his words out either. He also had a very severe speech impediment. And I remembered how when I asked him that and he couldn't get his words out, I did something really ignorant. I laughed. And then I remembered how my mother saw me laughing and came over and grabbed me by the arm and gave me this look I'd never seen before. And she pulled me aside and she said, "Bryan, don't you ever laugh at somebody because they can't get their words out right. Don't you ever do that." And I tried to defend myself. I said, "Mom, I didn't know." She said, "No, you know better than that." And then my mother looked at me and she said, "Now you go back over there and tell that little boy you're sorry." I said, "Okay, Mom." And I took a step and she grabbed me by the arm. She said, "Wait, after you tell that little boy you're sorry, I want you to hug that little boy." Kind of rolled my eyes. I said, "Okay, Mom." And I took a step and she said, grabbed me by the arm. She said, "Wait, after you hug that little boy, I want you to tell that little boy you love him." I said, "Mom, I can't go over there and tell that little boy." And she gave me that look again. So I said, okay. And on the night of this execution, I remembered going over to this little boy and walking up to him and saying, "Look, man, I'm sorry." And then I sort of lunged at him and gave him my little boy version of a man hug. And what I remembered was saying to this child, as insincerely as I possibly could, I said, I love you. And what I'd forgotten until that night was how that little boy hugged me back. And he whispered flawlessly in my ear, he said, "I love you too." And then the man was able to get his words out before they executed him. And he said to me, "Mr. Stevenson, I want to thank you for representing me." And then he said, "I want to thank you for fighting for me." And the last thing this man said to me was, "Mr. Stevenson, I love you for trying to save my life." He hung up the phone. They pulled him away. They strapped him to a gurney, and they executed him. I hung up the phone, and I said, "I can't do this anymore. It's too hard. It's just too hard." The question I had in my mind, the thought I had in my mind was how broken he was. And I kept asking myself, why do we want to kill all the broken people in this country? What is it about us that when we see brokenness, we want to step on it, we want to throw it away, we want to crush it? And then I said, I can't deal with this anymore. It's too hard, too hard, too hard, too hard. I'm going to stop. And then I started thinking about why I'd been doing what I do. And I realized that all of my clients are broken people. I represent the broken. People broken by poverty, broken by racism, broken by neglect, broken by abuse. I work in a broken system. We've got too many people who are too far away, who are not proximate, and they have power, and they're making judgments that are unjust. And so I don't want to have anything more to do with this. And that's when that kind of conversation you have to have when you're going to do something big kicked in. And I thought you better think about why you've been doing what you're doing. And I realized something I'd never realized before. All of a sudden, I realized why I do what I do. And what I realize is that I don't do what I do because I think it's important. I don't do what I do because it's about human rights. I don't do what I do because I've been trained to do it. I don't do what I do because I have a law degree. I don't do what I do because if I don't do it, no one else will. I don't do what I do because I get to talk to wonderful people like you. I realized that night that I do what I do because I'm broken too. And the truth is that when you get proximate, when you have to change narratives, when you have to stay hopeful in the face of inequality, when you do uncomfortable things, it will break you. You'll get little cuts and nicks. But I'm here to tell you there's a power in the broken. This country will not be saved by the elites, the privileged, those who are whole and happy. This country will be saved when broken people reach out and find and claim their humanity. It's the broken who understand the power of mercy. It is the broken who understand the need for compassion. It is the broken who can lead us to the places where justice must prevail. I believe really simple things. I believe that each person is more than the worst thing that they've ever done. I think if somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if somebody takes something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill somebody, you're not just a killer. And a system of justice that doesn't care about the other things you are is going to be fundamentally unjust. I tell you also, I don't believe that the opposite of poverty is wealth. I think we talk too much about money in America. I am persuaded that in this country, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And we've got to commit to more justice. And finally, I believe that when I come to the Bay Area, when I come to California, I can't judge how you're doing out here by how you treat the rich and the powerful and the privileged. There's a lot of incredible things going on. There are elites, there's Silicon Valley, there's these wonderful things, but I can't judge your character. I can't judge your commitment to justice by how you treat the rich and the powerful. I have to judge your character, your commitment to justice, not by how you treat the privileged, but by how you treat the poor, the incarcerated, and the condemned. That's the nexus that teaches me, tells me where we are. I'm going to end with this. It's difficult to do some of the things that we have to do to confront these big problems. We're going to talk about some of them. But I want you to know that there is precedent for doing them. I was giving a talk not too long ago, and an older man came into the church where I was talking. He was an older black man. He was in a wheelchair, and he had this very stern, almost angry look on his face the whole time I was talking. He was actually unnerving me because he was staring at me so hard, I couldn't figure out what the problem was. I finished my talk. People came up. They were very nice and appropriate, but that man kept staring at me at the back. When everybody else left, he got a young kid to wheel him up to me at the front of the church, and he came down the center aisle of this church with this stern look on his face. And when he got in front of me, he put his hand up and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I was stunned. I just stood there. And then he asked me again, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I stepped back and I mumbled something. I don't even remember what I said. And then he asked me one last time, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And then this man looked at me, he said, "I'm going to tell you what you're doing." And he looked at me and he said, "You're beating the drum for justice. You keep beating the drum for justice." And I was so moved. I was also really relieved because I just didn't know. Then he grabbed me by my jacket and he pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, "Come here, come here, come here. I'm going to show you something." And then this man looked at me and he turned his head. He said, "You see this scar I have behind my right ear?" He said, "I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama, 1963, trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this cut I have down here, the bottom of my neck?" He said, "I got that cut in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964, trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this dark spot?" He said, "That's my bruise. I got my bruise in Birmingham, 1965, trying to register people to vote." He said, "I'm going to tell you something, young man." He said, "People look at me. They think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars." He said, "But I'm going to tell you something." He said, "These aren't my cuts. These aren't my bruises. These aren't my scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." What we are going to have to do to change this nation, what we're going to have to do to advance justice is get proximate, to change narratives, to be hopeful, to do some uncomfortable things and not worry about the cuts and the nicks. Sometimes they are the things that liberate us. They are the things that honor us. You honor me by giving me this opportunity to be here with you tonight, and I want to thank you for all the work that I hope will continue in this place, in your hearts, in your minds, in your lives, as we try to advance justice. Thank you very, very much.
To understand the injustice African Americans face today, we need to recognize the historical context. From slavery to Jim Crow laws, the legacy of racism has been embedded in American societies. Although the civil rights movement made significant strides towards equality, the remnant of this injustice continues to impact African Americans in profound ways. One of the most pressing issues is police brutality and the criminal justice system. African Americans are disproportionately targeted by law enforcement, facing racial profiling, excessive force, and harsher sentencing compared to their white counterparts. The tragic death of individuals like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many others have ignited national and global protests, highlighting the urgent need for police reform and accountability. Economic inequality is another significant issue. African Americans face higher unemployment rates and wage disparities, with many stuck in low-paying jobs. Systemic barriers, such as discriminatory hiring practices and limited access to quality education, have contributed to the racial wage gap. The impact of these economic disparities can be seen in communities struggling to access basic resources like healthcare, housing, and education. Education is a critical area where injustice persists. Many schools in predominantly black neighborhoods are underfunded and overcrowded, leading to disparities in educational outcomes. These inequalities affect access to higher education and future jobs opportunities, perpetuating the cycle of poverty and disadvantage for many African American families. Healthcare disparities also play a crucial role in the injustice African Americans face. Healthcare disparities also play a crucial role in this injustice African Americans face. Systemic racism in healthcare has led to inequitable access to medical services and poorer health outcomes. African Americans are more likely to suffer from chronic illnesses and have less access to quality healthcare. Despite these challenges, there is hope. Activism and community organizing have been powerful tools in the fight against injustice. Movements like Black Lives Matter have raised awareness about systemic racism and mobilized people across the country to demand change. It is crucial for us all to support this movement and advocate for policies that promote equity and justice. So what can we do? Start by educating yourself and those around you about the history and current realities of racial injustice. Support Black-owned businesses, amplify Black voices, and advocate for policies that promote equality. Change starts with awareness, and together we can work towards a more just and equitable society. Thank you for watching. Do not forget to like and share your thoughts in the comment box below. Until next time, cheers and have a good one.